I can hear it. It's better now, but I can hear it's like a tiny little bit, but it seems a little bit better. Awesome. All right, so we'll get started. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining the Cal Academy IBSS Research Seminar. My name is Rebecca Johnson. I co-direct citizen science at the Cal Academy for those of you who are joining from outside. Our team, which includes Allison Young, the other co-director of citizen science, and Gio Rapacciolo, who is our data scientist. We all invited these folks, Tom and Stu, to join us today to talk about the Conservation Lands Network 2.0. So just for a little background, the Bay Area Conservation Lands Network is a project of Together Bay Area, which you may know by its previous name, the Bay Area Open Space Council. Together Bay Area is a regional coalition of nonprofits, public agencies, and indigenous tribes working together for climate resilient lands, including lands that are natural, working, rural, and urban. Today, we're going to hear from Tom Robinson, who is the principal of Tom Robinson Consulting. Tom leads strategic planning and analysis projects that serve the public good. He directs the Conservation Lands Network, which is a project of Together Bay Area, and assists nonprofits and municipalities in planning for landscape health and climate adaptation. His academic training is in ecology, geographic analyses, and he's a Switzer Environmental Leadership Fellow. And we'll also hear from Dr. Stu Weiss. Stu is the chief scientist at Creekside Science. I'm super jealous that he's been doing field work during the shutdown. He has served as a science advisor to the Conservation Lands Network since 2006. He has wide-ranging research experience in conservation and population biology, microclimate characterization, and statistical analysis. He worked for over 15 years at the Center for Conservation Biology at Stanford University, and he's authored more than 25 scientific publications and has served as a PI for more than 50 government grants and contracts. And we're super thrilled to have you guys introduce the Conservation Lands Network 2.0 to the Academy Research Division and the other folks that are joining. So without further ado, before I hand it over actually to Tom, if you have questions, feel free to write your questions in the chat. I'll moderate them at the end. And if you don't want to write your question, you can just put little question marks and I will call on you. All right, so I'll turn it over to Tom.
Awesome. Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, just on behalf of Stu and myself, I want to thank you for inviting us and hosting us. We'd love to be there in person, love to meet some of you, but alas, I certainly hope everybody's doing well and healthy and your families are healthy as well. We will gladly take this opportunity to connect with you all remotely. I also want to welcome and thank any of the steering committee, this Conservation Lands Network 2.0 steering committee members or focus team members who are joining us today. Welcome. So Stu and I have about a 45-minute presentation for you that we're hoping will sort of firmly put the Conservation Lands Network on your radar screen. And we're also hoping that it'll spark some conversation at the end. We hope to leave a decent amount of time for that, hopefully about 10 minutes. But yeah, just to Rebecca's point, it'd be great to, if questions come up for you, type those into the chat bar real time. We'd love to, if we can't get to them, we'd love to collect those and answer them in some other way. So right, I'm going to start, give you sort of the tour of the Conservation Lands Network, and then about halfway through, I'm going to ask Stu to come in and present some more material about species and climate change, and then we'll wrap it up and have we're going to be moving fairly quickly through these slides, but all of what we're presenting today is found at bayarealands.org. Primarily through the reports, maps, and data and the Explorer tool. You can see the buttons there. So I encourage you to check that out. Yeah, the Conservation Lands Network. It was first launched in 2011, and between 2017 and 2019, we updated the entire framework through a project we called the Conservation Lands Network 2.0 Science Expansion Project. Which we launched in November of last year. So we're kind of getting the word out about it now. And the geography of the Conservation Lands Network is the upland habitats of the San Francisco Bay Area. So here are the baylands, And here are the areas that we are, that the Conservation Lands Network focuses on. And the geography of the Conservation Lands Network is not only the uplands, but it's the 9 counties that touch the bay, plus Santa Cruz. So when we talk about a regional conservation vision, which is what the Conservation Lands Network is, this is what we're talking about. Many of you know that California is a nationally recognized biodiversity hotspot, and the Bay Area is a particularly high area of high species richness. It basically means that we have a lot of species that evolved here or call this place their home. And really, amazingly, nearly all of the pre-European contact species are still here. Are they all doing well? Not all of them. And we've done a number on their habitat. And climate change is certainly not helping. We're looking at possible extinctions in the future if things are not done about climate change. And we are also looking at area. Forecasts are, approximately 2 million people by 2040. So what, with all of that going on, what we need is strategy. This is a good time to get strategic about which lands we're going to ensure are conserved in perpetuity. There's a lot of pressure on those lands and on those habitats. And the CLN is based on the idea that what we need is an inspiring vision that focuses conservation efforts, and that also provides an accounting framework to track and communicate progress by the many land conservation organizations that operate in the Bay Area. And indeed, what we are proposing and putting forward through the Conservation Lands Network is that we all work toward a goal of conserving 2.5 million acres of priority lands by 2050, which is about half the Bay Area. And so is that doable? We think it is. This is a trajectory over the course of 7 years of land conservation in the Bay Area. And if you take this trend and you push it out to 2050, you get to about 2.5 million acres sometime between 2045 and 2050, which is happy faces all around. That this might be, that happy face might also be a little optimistic. The larger parcels are fewer and fewer, but this is still an excellent goal. It's also a goal that local jurisdictions can use to rally around policies that complement land conservation activities. And before I go any further, I'll just mention what I'm talking about when I say land conservation activities. I'm talking about land that is conserved in perpetuity and I'm talking about fee title transactions, but also conservation easements of working lands, keeping those lands working and producing food and fiber for the Bay Area and elsewhere through conservation easements. So a key question is, if we're going for half the Bay Area, the key question is which half? We don't want just any old 2.5 million acres in a network of conserved lands. We want to make sure that that network, what we're all rowing in the same direction toward, covers the sum total of the biodiversity and the different habitats that we have in the Bay Area. And of course, in the Bay Area, we have a legacy of both urbanization and cultivation and conservation. So here's just a quick snapshot of kind of where we are right now. About 1.5 million acres of cultivated and urbanized land, and about 1.4 million acres of conserved land. So let's look at this same area through the lens of the Conservation Lands Network. And so what you're looking at is about 4.8 million acres of terrestrial land. And as I mentioned, about 1.5 million are cultivated or urbanized, which leaves about 3.3 million acres of natural or semi-natural land. About 1.4 million are conserved. which leaves about 1.9 million acres of unprotected upland habitat. And the Conservation Lands Network is a data-driven, spatially explicit conservation vision that we think can covers all of the types of habitat out there, and in the right amounts per our experts, and in the right configurations, or a very efficient configuration. And so the idea at about 1.3 million acres of strategic opportunities. And those from that 1.3, we might get the 1.1 and ultimately get to 2.5 million acres. So that's kind of the overarching kind of conservation strategy. So you might be wondering, how were those blue areas selected? So we used a coarse filter, fine filter approach to conservation planning. And I should just mention that, again, this is Conservation Lands Network 2.0, and so we are updating the network from 1.0 that was published in 2011, and it was during that process that the coarse filter, fine filter approach to conservation planning was adopted, and it's still very much relevant today, and so we're continuing it with 2.0. But the coarse filter, fine filter approach to conservation planning is fairly simple. It's the idea that if you start with your habitat structures, your grasslands, your shrubs, your forests of different types, and those being representations of the ecosystems across the landscape, that if you prioritize and you create goals based on those mapped ecotypes, that you will meet most of the habitat requirements for most of your native species. But things fall through the cracks, and so you need your fine filter to catch those. This graph is from, it's just a nice graphic from Canada, so you're getting things like caribou habitat falling through the cracks. But in our area, things like ponds that are not well mapped in our regional vegetation maps, rookeries that are also not mapped, spotted owl nests, things like that. We have a whole slew of those. So the idea is then you create a list of fine filter conservation targets and you prioritize those as well. So creating the network starts by creating these, or kind of segregating the Bay Area into these geophysical settings, which we call levels, and these serve to disaggregate the network design in order to basically, using GIS, create a mini network of connected habitat for each landscape unit. We take a vegetation map, and the one that we use has about 80 mapped natural vegetation communities, and then intersect those with those landscape units, and you convert a mapped type into a conservation target when you combine those two. So for example, this is what blue oak woodland in the Blue Ridge Berryessa landscape unit looks like. And this is what blue oak woodland looks like in the Russian River Valley. It's much more rare in the Russian River Valley. It's far more ubiquitous in Napa. So we don't necessarily want the blue oak in Napa County competing with the blue oak in Russian River, because as we ask the GIS to go and create a design that covers blue oak, it'll go right to Napa and say, oh, we can get a lot of bang for our buck in Napa County. We don't have to worry about those other places. So we want to sort of localize these habitat types. So those then serve as our coarse filter targets. And there's about 1,200 of them. And we ranked each one of them. So this is what they look like up close. Our vegetation ecologist volunteers ranked every one of those 1,200 plus conservation targets. And rank ones, we ask the GIS to make sure that our network has 90% of the occurrences of rank 1 vegetation types, 75% of rank 2s, and 50% of rank 3s, and 0 of rank 4s. Rank 4s are urbanized and cultivated areas, places where the habitat has been wiped off. And so here is literally what the kind of the accounting framework looks like for each one of these. We have in our Santa Cruz Mountains South landscape unit, we have a list of rank we get our total acreage goals, which is basically 90, 75, or 50% times the total acreage. How much of it is already conserved, and then how much more? Sorry, I should be going through these different. And how much more is met? How much more is needed in order to meet our conservation goals? And then we also want to make a check that is that actually in the network? So we should get a positive figures there. So that's how the background of the course filter work. And here's another look at these different rarity ranks. Again, that's the kind of the terminology. Our vegetation ecologists were looking for rarity. And you'll see that rarity, the dark red there, there's there are many types of rank 1 course filter conservation targets, but their distribution is fairly limited. So only about 142,000 acres in the Bay Area of rank 1s, and you can see the distribution of the others. Obviously, rank 3s are our most common vegetation types. They're not terribly rare, still important, but they're not rare. And obviously, that's what we're seeing a lot more of those than the others. Examples of these, examples of rank 1s, blue oak woodland in Russian River Valley, as I mentioned, old growth redwood anywhere, maritime chaparral anywhere. Examples of rank 2s, montane hardwood, coast live oak. Example of rank 3 is annual grasslands. So give you a sense for what those look like. Now let's talk about fine filter conservation targets. These are those pieces that kind of are not well mapped in our ecosystem or ecotypes map. Things like ponds. And also we didn't really get in our vegetation map was where there is some structure information, but we didn't get a good sense for where there are sort of large complex forests. And so we used ancillary data to point to those areas. A list of all the various types of fine filter conservation target data that we used. You'll see the California Natural Diversity Database listed there. You'll also see data that were volunteered from our focus team members. These are volunteer experts. And so, there are point occurrences like northern spotted owl and Alameda whipsnake. And then there's also areas like Todd Keeler-Wolf's database of maritime chaparral. So all of these are ranked, and these are put into our model as well. You might be wondering if iNaturalist was used. We actually did not use iNaturalist as point occurrences to be ranked. However, iNaturalist was incredibly important as we went through the different species conservation targets that we selected. So each taxon gets its own list of conservation targets that we're making sure that the network works for. We used iNaturalist as in those meetings to get a sense for the distribution of those species. Obviously, the shift that's caused by obscuring the exact location of threatened and endangered species caused a little bit of an issue. However, we were still definitely able to use it. We were able to kind of pan out and say, well, is this species still around in the Bay Area? iNaturalist was really helpful for that. Okay, so we're not done creating the network. We need some summarizing areas in which to kind of build all of these priorities into so that we can string the areas together of the network. And we use these 250 acre or 100 hectare cells, these hexagonal network to do that, or a grid, I should call it. And the reason why we did that is, well, first of all, there's 2 more sides than a pixel, than a square. And also, 250 acres is about the average size of a land conservation project in the Bay Area. So it was a good, the GIS analysis tool that we used, kind of where to bias, or where to move into. So we said, hey, move away from really dense places, move away from places with really close to roads, and move away from places that have been highly parcelized. We merged all that together. So to recap, we have our coarse filters, we have our fine filters, we have our ranks, and we have this cost layer, and we have our existing protected areas database. And the cost, ranks, and protected areas are the 3 inputs for a a kind of a reserve design tool that's commonly used both in marine and terrestrial environments called marksan. And marksan produces a draft network to review with your steering committee and others that it iterates through millions of iterations 20 times and comes up with a near optimal network that achieves the goals, these acreage goals that we put, based on these rarity ranks. It achieves those goals in a as optimized or sort of efficient spatially way possible. So here's a close-up of the draft network. So these hexagons are chosen because there's some goal that some conservation target goal that we needed to meet. But we're not done there. We take the footprint of urban and rural residential and cultivated lands, and we go ahead and clip those out of the draft network because it just makes those boundaries of the hexagons a little smarter, a little bit more aware of what's actually on the ground. And so then we're not done either. We do two enhancements to the network, and one of them is to add in stream valleys. Stream valleys, as you all are aware, are sort of engines of biodiversity. They are hydrologic sort of veins and arteries areas very well. So we modeled broad areas across the stream valley going from upland fringe to upland fringe. And we went ahead and just burned those right into the network because they're so important and they're going to be very important for climate change. Here's a close-up of our modeling tools. Here you can see in the photo, you can see the floodplain of this stretch of Childs Creek and Napa. You can see the terrace and you can see the upland fringe. And here's a digital elevation model showing what this stream valleys model that we helped develop captures. The second thing that we did with the network is we wanted to make sure that these patches of the network themselves were connected. So we ran a least cost paths analysis on the patches of the network, and we burned in or kind of built in those areas that ensure a network connectivity. So we end up with this sort of four-tiered look at the Bay Area, the upland habitats of the Bay Area, and we have our essential types. Those are areas that were chosen 15 or more times out of those 20 marksan runs. Important were between 10 and 15 connectors I just mentioned, and then anything that is not developed is still valuable to the Conservation Lands Network. There's still goals to be met, and we call those contributing areas. One of the things that the network itself doesn't necessarily capture really well are aquatic or fish, stream dwelling and stream dependent species like fish. And so we worked with our riparian and fish focus team to prioritize stream reaches based on presence of coho salmon and inland steelhead and presence of inland native fish and coastal steelhead streams. Run these analyses and get all this input, but what do you do with all of this stuff? There's two main uses of the Conservation Lands Network, and one of the first ones is, or the first one I wanted to mention is this use as a regional habitat goals accounting framework. So we can over time look at how much land is being conserved in the Bay Area, and at different time points we can come back to our goals and ask, kind of like that thermometer on the side of your child's school, going toward the education foundation. How much are we going toward our goals? How much are we advancing toward our goals? And so, for instance, if we look at between CLN 1.0 and 2.0, we've increased our goals by 12% in Blue Oak Foothill Pine Woodland, 11% for Serpentine Grassland, almost 10% for knobcone pine. And we can also look at the key conservation actions that led to these advances as well. And on the flip side, we can look at places that are sort of chronically underserved, like our alluvial riparian areas or our white oak, Oregon oak, and black oak forests are sort of hovering at around 20%. So this is useful information for our local land conservationists to go to their boards, their public, their funders, and say, this is why we're focusing on these areas. Here's the math that supports our action in this area. We're not just sort of willy-nilly protecting land. There's a strategy behind what we're doing. And then down at the project scale, the Conservation Lands Network is really useful. So you can go to the conservation, or go to bayarealands.org and log on to our Explorer tool. And this is an interactive tool where you can drop a pin, you can draw a line and buffer it, or you can draw a boundary around an area that you are interested in, or you can specific location. You can generate a report. We also serve up a whole slew of different data layers that you can just hunt and pack and take a look at. And I'll let you guys do that on your own. It's mobile friendly, so you can do it right now, but please don't stay with us and do it afterward. And you can get these customized reports for your area. And this is just an example area. I just dropped a pin and buffered it by a mile. The report gives you highlights about the area, what are the top regional habitat goals, and what would the contribution to those goals be if you were to conserve this land. We give you the kind of the math and the accounting for the different coarse filter vegetation targets and the different fine filter vegetation targets that exist there. And we also give you information that's beyond biodiversity, things like recreation in the area and how visible it is. How does it contribute to the kind of the local visual character? Is it used, or is it important for food production? How about fire hazard reduction? If you were to conserve this land, is it a high fire intensity? What's the probability of it burning? If a land conservation organization were to conserve it and manage it for its fuels, that actually protects the community from fire risk. Flood hazard risk, same idea. How much above ground carbon is being stored there? And is it part of a water supply for people? All of this is really strategic information as people are building the case for conservation. So all of this information is packaged into several different deliverables here. The first, and I really encourage you to download the report, the Conservation Lands Network 2.0 report. There's loads of information in there. We're really proud of it. There's a lot of information that's just about the Bay Area, about species. There's so much more. I could go on, but customized reports that you can generate, which we call the conservation portfolio reports. And there's also a dashboard at bayarealands.org that looks at really high-level conservation goals for the region and sort of shows you how we're doing against those, including the 2.5 million acre. And then there's all of the GIS data that's compiled into a GIS database that you can download. And in there is an ArcMap, formatted ArcMap project that you can just connect the data to, and you're off and running. And if you do use the tool, the Explorer tool, there's this little Hotjar feedback button. We'd love to hear from you. It's a quick, hey, I like this and this is why, or hey, I wish it did this, or I wish I could see this. That's all really useful information, and we would appreciate it if you're using the Explorer. And just a brief note that we certainly did not do this in a silo. This was a very collaborative process. We had about 145 people volunteered their time to make the Conservation Lands Network happen. Starting with our 32-member steering committee, all these wonderful people from a really wide variety of different organizations, from nonprofits to government agencies to joint ventures. We had our taxonomic focus teams. We had a vegetation focus team, fish and riparian and habitat focus team, mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, and vertebrates focus team. We also had these thematic focus teams, folks that helped us characterize sort of the policy, funding, and land use planning landscapes out there. So we thank those folks. We also thank our stewardship focus team that helped us with our messaging on stewardship, and our rangeland focus team that helped us understand the role of rangelands in the Bay Area and to the achieving the Conservation Lands Network, which is rangelands play a huge role. About half the viewers, and we had our web technology folks. So anyway, just wanted to highlight that, if you're in conservation planning, that the success of any strategic conservation planning framework is collaborating with stakeholders, with your end users. So again, all of this is at bayarealands.org. These folks helped us prepare different chapters on the different taxa. If you're curious at all, I highly recommend going and taking a look at these chapters. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Stu to cover 2 frequently asked questions, which are, what does CLN say about Bay Area biodiversity at the species level? And then what does the CLN offer about climate change and landscape resilience? So I'm going to mute myself, and Stu, you take it away.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thumbs up?
Thumbs up. Yeah.
Cool. So, yeah, you're my next button. So, we have a dazzling diversity of species, and we just wanted to talk about some of the highlights that came out. We were very excited to find out that the river otter has returned very strongly in the North Bay and the East Bay, less so in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And this is a really good example of citizen science via the River Otter Ecology projects, where there are otter spotters out there who are finding where the otters are. Otters are great, but there's potentially some conflict with the restoration of fisheries. So, it's a complex web of life out there, and we're going to be finding some very interesting perceived conflicts. Next. The monarch butterfly has been big in the news because the western population, which overwinters in California, has collapsed. So they show up in California in October and November, and they seek out, at this point, primarily groves of non-native eucalyptus trees to spend the winter. And it turns out the Bay Area has about 30% of the overwintering monarch population. So we're absolutely critical for the long run, even the short run. We also have a lot of breeding habitat, so that the milkweeds out in your rangelands and open spaces are providing food for monarch larvae, allowing for breeding. Next. Another return story is return of the beaver. Beavers are repopulating many streams, and they act as an ecosystem engineer and are really transformative for riparian habitats and fish. They might be the key to coho salmon recovery along the coast by slowing down the movement of water and creating habitat complexity. The camera trap revolution really made our mammals distributions and understanding so much better. So this is a picture of a western spotted skunk, which are actually quite rare in the Bay Area. There's only a few places where we still find western spotted skunk, and I bet a lot of you didn't even know there was a western spotted skunk out there, not the striped skunks that are in urban areas. Picture of a long-tailed weasel found on San Bruno Mountain, which was kind of surprising because San Bruno Mountain is this island surrounded by urban areas, and the long-tailed weasels have been found in multiple places there. Next. The badger really charismatic mesofauna. And we're finding out, and by canvassing our team, that badgers are really well distributed in the Bay Area, but they're at risk. Discovering new populations of highly endangered taxa like the Santa Cruz kangaroo rat. Next. Oh, you went back to badgers. Oh. You know, we're finding great pictures out there. I'm sure you've all seen the coyote and badger video taken by Pathways for Wildlife and Peninsula Open Space Trust, but we come across, you know, a badger and a bobcat sharing a culvert. Next. The importance of these culverts for connectivity are they can't be overemphasized, that that's how a lot of these mammals are getting around. This happens to be a long-tailed weasel, looking really cute for such a mean little animal. Next slide. And the Santa Cruz Puma Project and other studies of our mountain lions have revealed incredible things about how they use habitat through these GPS collars and simply spotting mountain lions. And now that the mountain lion is a candidate for threatened status under the California Endangered Species Act, it's really elevated in importance. Next slide. The coho salmon in the Bay Area are in total crisis. Santa Cruz Mountains are almost devoid of coho salmon anymore, and the North Bay population are vanishingly small. Next. There's an official recovery plan for all three of our anadromous salmonids that we defer to in terms of the prioritization, but CLN can provide that accounting framework for watershed and stream channel protection. Next. In the fish world, we found our fish team pointed out that these adfluvial trout that use reservoirs for feeding and then they run up the creeks to spawn are actually the original genetic stock that despite all the stocking programs, we still have these original genetic stock surviving in these streams above reservoirs. And we just upgraded those streams to our highest priority, priority 1, because of the importance of that genetic resource. Burrowing owl, they like short grassland and grazing lands. They're actually quite dependent on rangelands. In the Bay Area, we have a major overwintering population. Summer breeding is more restricted, but our role for the Western U.S. as an overwintering area can't be underestimated. And this is a species that's covered by our major habitat conservation plans and natural community conservation plans. Actually, most of the rare species in an area. Then we have the Bay checker spot butterfly, really drove the Valley Habitat Plan in Santa Clara County, the acquisition of Coyote Ridge Open Space Preserve and other properties. And it's a really poster child for the interrelationship between nitrogen deposition from the smog clouds over our cities, which increases the growth of grass, that are controlled by well-managed cattle grazing because cows eat the grass. And there's been a lot of reintroduction attempts at various sites with very active management. Next. Transition. There are notes about all of these target species in Appendix C of the CLN report and at bayarealands.org. We just canvassed, accumulated a lot of interesting information that's not necessarily out there in written literature, just from our focus teams. So this is a really valuable compilation. Okay, so what do we offer about climate change and landscape resilience? we're feeling the effects of climate change. So most important thing globally is clear pathways to suitable climate and habitat. As sea levels are rising and driving stuff away from the bay, but also as species readjust their ranges to track suitable climates. Next. So our friends at the Nature Conservancy contributed some GIS layers that ask how diverse and how connected are areas. The diversity is based on a couple of topographic factors that create a lot of topoclimatic diversity. And the connection is based on a permeability surface. How permeable is the landscape to movement, how few barriers there are. So then making sure that the cell N is connected across our valley bottoms, which tend to be quite heavily developed. So within landscape units, we're striving to create a single large block of conserved habitat. And between the landscape units, we have to look at pinch points, choke points, and bottlenecks that allows critters to move. And then, of course, we want to be connected beyond the Bay Area, which is especially important down in the South Bay. So we incorporated the Bay Area critical linkages, which is using least cost paths, creative linkages. This was the project led by Sea Wildlands. The Nature Conservancy once again came through with this product called Omniscape. That's a structural connectivity model that's not any particular species. It's just how permeable is the landscape and what are the multiple pathways that allow for connectivity within and between the landscape units. And there are several well-advanced landscape linkage projects in the Bay Area, up in the Sonoma Valley, down in Coyote Valley, and along Highway 17, among the most that are advanced. And this has led to substantial land acquisition and improvements of wildlife passage. Next slide. We wanted to understand where was vegetation most vulnerable to increased drought stress, because that's the trend, is that we have longer, hotter summers. Vegetation is more exposed to drought stress, and it's a very, very important limitation. So we combined our vegetation types with a measure of drought stress developed by USGS hydrologists, and came up with this map that shows the vulnerability, which basically how close to your drought tolerance is that particular stand of vegetation. So we're not picking a particular climate future, it's what we call scenario neutral. The increase in this climatic water deficit or the drought stress is a robust projection because, again, as truncated rainy seasons and higher summer temperatures. And this particular product projects loss, but not what comes in afterwards. So it's showing where things are vulnerable, and it makes biogeographic sense from a vegetation ecology viewpoint. And we report on this, the vegetation that's in your Explorer area gets ranked from low risk to high risk, and then where you fall on this landscape resilience and landscape connectivity scales compared to the rest of the Bay Area. So we report on this for specific places.
And this is a snapshot of the conservation portfolio report that I mentioned before. So there's a separate page about landscape resilience.
So, how does all this get implemented? We have an amazing conservation community. We have ongoing acquisitions by open space and park agencies. Land trusts are moving fast. Working lands easements like the California Rangeland Trust are absolutely becoming critical. We're getting a lot of mitigation lands, especially through these habitat conservation plans and natural community conservation plans. Then the policies that prevent or slow development until permanent protection is possible. The advocacy groups are key. And lastly, there's kind of this level of de facto protection at present because of remoteness and ruggedness. It's like, who's going to do anything back there? And then, just making sure the land doesn't get developed is only the first step. Big emphasis on stewardship. So biodiversity is not going to take care of itself in a rapidly changing environment. So we wanted to, answer the question or address the question, how do we ensure there's sufficient expertise and funding and effective stewardship? And we have extensive discussions of this in CLN 2.0, and then in CLN 1.0, can't forget that report, Chapter 9 outlines a lot of specific resource management issues. And then happy California cows grazing among the wildflowers are maintaining the wildflowers because they're eating the grass. And this is a story across most of the Bay Area rangelands, is that California grasslands are real hotspots for biodiversity. And cattle grazing turns out to be the best method for keeping the non-native annual grasses down over large areas. So a lot of collaboration with the ranching community out there. So some of the opportunities we were coming up with that might be of interest to folks associated with the Cal Academy is, first, we're 15 years into this. We started in 2006. There's 3 series of reports. And this is a ready-made framework for hanging new biological data on. It's like, how many species did you find in the bioflits? And this will give you a context of where that spot is relative to the rest of the conservation land network. Then there's like the treasure hunt, this iNaturalist documentation of things like local rarities at a landscape scale. So this beautiful little Brodia is locally rare in the Santa Cruz Mountains landscape. Where are the range limits and outliers of common species? Really important for climate change, finding the cool, moist refugia and what we call the arid leading edge. So like a little stand of chamise, chaparral, or even a few plant individuals of chamise, which is an arid adapted species, in the middle of a redwood forest is a really important resource. So let's go out and find them and document them.
Great, thank you, Stu. Well, that's what we have for you today. We'd love to, if it's possible, to get a little moderated Q&A going, but just want to briefly acknowledge our collaborators here and our funding, Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, the California State Coastal Conservancy. Want to acknowledge Together Bay Area, which is the regional coalition of nonprofits and agencies that are working to conserve, steward, and get people connected to the land in the Bay Area. And I, again, just want to thank Cal Academy for hosting us today. Yeah, from the bottom of our hearts. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks, you guys, so much. There are a couple questions in the chat. So the first is from Orr, who asked, Tom, I think it was for you when you were talking about ranking, especially. Do you take into account how high risk different areas are for development in the planning tools?
Oh, Stu, did you want to?
Go for it, Tom.
Oh, I was just going to say briefly, so it's sort of implied in the rarity. So rarity could be natural distribution, there's just naturally rare. And then rare is also caused by anthropogenic forces. So kind of heuristic, it's kind of, expert driven. So we didn't use any sort of data to show where things are at risk. But we just relied on our local experts. So
yeah, so one of the metrics I believe we report on is the Greenbelt Alliance comes up with a lands at risk map every few years, and we report on whether how much those at-risk lands are conserved, and whether you're in a at-risk area.
Right. Great question.
Great. We have one question from Aaron. Aaron, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. Are you guys able to hear and see me?
Yeah.
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 Alrighty. Yeah. Thank you so much for the talk. So it was really cool. So my question is sort of pertaining to grazing in those areas. And so I was curious if you assign priority of areas that have been historically grazed over others. Because, for example, I did some work in Morgan Territory, so property that's owned by Save Mount Diablo, which has been very heavily grazed. And then I did a very similar experiment on the actual property that was owned by the National Park Service on Mount Diablo itself, so areas that have not been grazed. And I noticed a substantial difference in arthropod community. You know, it seems that, for example, blue oaks have this undergrowth vegetative area that harbors a lot more diversity of invertebrate arthropods, as opposed to Mount Diablo, which had just grazing, dead grass in these stands of blue oak. So, I suppose, are you taking into consideration historical grazing or more newer grazing in these areas of higher or lower priority? Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, totally. That's a great question. The short answer is no. We didn't get that nuanced with the prioritization, but we do talk about the this goes, what you just described goes right into Stu's point that just having a deed restriction over a patch of land is only the first or part of the story. How that land is managed. So we talk about it a lot, but and the importance of that, but it's not built into the prioritization. Every time you build in more nuance to the prioritization, you have to sort of control for lack of information. What is the effect that's going to have, that factor is going to have on the ultimate network? You also reduce the amount of people that can grok what you're doing as you build in lots of nuance. And we want this to work for people, and we want it to be understood by people. So that's the tack we took. But Stu, do you have any brief things to add to that?
So the grazing issue is really, really complicated. There are a lot of native species, a lot of native vertebrates that really depend on grazing. The Baker's spot butterfly utterly depends on grazing. And we just don't have the grazing map in the Bay Area. It's something we've talked about trying to generate, is like, where are the private lands that are being grazed, and then filing public grazing pieces, so we can start understanding how often and where, and then use that, start doing biodiversity surveys across grazed and ungrazed areas. I can certainly tell you in my experience that if you want the good wildflower displays in an area that's getting hit by smog from upwind urban areas, you want to go to the grazed areas. It's a lot of ungrazed areas are just piled up with thatch, and you lose the diversity. So it's something that's really specific to particular parcels, and one of the things we're finding is having a diversity of grazing regimes is really, really important.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, Aaron, we'd love to follow up with you on that study too. That's a great piece of information there. Do we have time for one more?
Yeah, does anyone, I have a quick question unless anybody else has one. Anyone else? Well, I'll ask mine really quickly, you guys. I know that you purposely exclude urban and suburban and developed lands, and I'm just thinking about those lands as potential pathways, especially connective tissue between bigger open space. And I wonder, it's kind of like CLN 3.0, but you know what you all are thinking about as far as the you know, how we can work within urban and suburban lands to, you know, create habitat corridors and think about those as conservation lands as well.
Yeah, excellent point. Go ahead, Stu.
I just want to weigh in. There's an amazing vision out there put out by San Francisco Estuary Institute called Reoaking Silicon Valley, basically talking about trying to create a urbanized oak savanna, and finding these patches where we can get native species in that will support native wildlife within the urban matrix. All of the streams that are going through our urban areas are part of CLN. We couldn't come up with any sort of consistent, condition of those streams because those data are just below the scale. So we just said all of these stream valleys, all the areas that are geomorphically stream valleys, they're part of the network, even if they're not conserved, even if they're already converted. So, I mean, it is a great frontier, and there's a lot of opportunities. But we got to secure the upland areas that aren't developed in order to have biodiversity to feed into the urban areas.
Yeah, we're at time, so I would just second everything that Stu said, and I would just say that, Rebecca, I think that's such a good question, and work that we can be doing between now and 3.0. We can start to illuminate the importance of remnant patches and those especially upland bayland transition zone that's on the urban fringe as well. So there's work to be done for sure.
Thanks, guys. Well, I look forward to talking more with you both and strategizing on how we can work together more in the future, hopefully in person. Thanks to everyone for joining today.
Yes,
I definitely encourage you all to check out the online tools and explore places that you know and love, and just think about how important this tool is for planning for the Bay Area. And also think about how Academy species occurrence data, whether it's INAT or collections data, could help inform and improve some of our understanding of these places. So
we'd love to hear that. Absolutely.
So thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your week and stay safe and healthy. All right.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Everyone's slowly jumping off. So that was great, you guys. It was really nice to hear it again. I was thinking how I can't believe it was 6 months ago that that you guys first had the kind of launch of this. It seems like maybe a million years ago. So.
Yeah, it's one of those weird things that it feels both just recent and also a million years. Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a discontinuity in time.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Natalie will, or Catherine, I think actually will send out the recording.
Mm-hmm.
And Natalie will end it. I don't think I can end it. She is maybe she can end it. And we'll get it out to you guys, and then it'll be on our website as well, so you can always share it, which is great. So you have like a nice recording that you can share.
Yeah, indeed, and good exposure. Yeah, I can't thank you enough. This is great.
Yeah, it was really good, and I don't know if you saw, like Scott Sampson, our new ED, was on the call for most of the time. So
good.
He's super interested in this stuff and ways that we can work together, I think. So
good. Yeah, excellent.
Yeah.
We'd be more than happy to come and give an in-person discussion, and see where we can go, because Cal Academy is just such a unique institution in the Bay Area, and just getting a good collaboration going together would mutually beneficial.
Yeah, I think once we can meet back in person, it would be great to think about, you guys and some strategic, folks from your planning team, and then folks from the academy, and just really think about, shared ideas and thoughts. And we have a whole team working on some California stuff.
I did one of your night at the museum or.
Oh yeah, the nightlife. That's one of the things I was supposed to mention, is that everyone can come to nightlife tonight. There's one of the live nightlifes happening, and Natalie's talking about plants, and it's going to be really cool. So glad you went.
Yeah, that was really fun. I had a little table and talked about some of the climate work.
Yeah, I know Tom has done it before as well.
Yeah,
and when we used to do the urban, before the City Nature Challenge, we usually do one. Now they've gone all online, obviously, but someday we'll be able to have something that might look like that again. So
we will.
We will. Might look a little different. But.
Well, thanks
awesome,
again.
Guys.
It was great.
Thank you so much. Tom, we have a meeting tomorrow. So.
Yeah, so Rebecca, if you could give us a list of the people who actually attended, I always find that to be interesting and useful.
Yeah, I can see if I can recall that. I think we actually could go back in the video and see a list of the names, but I can try and see, and I can definitely get you a list of who gets it from the academy.
Yeah, we're just interested in knowing who's seen it or not.
Yeah, exactly.
If you run into somebody at a random meeting, and it's like, oh, you must. It just really helps.
Yeah,
totally.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great. I'll see what I can do on that front.
Awesome. Well, we'll talk to you tomorrow.
All right, we'll talk soon.
Yeah.
All
Thanks
right.
again for the opportunity.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank
I
you.
guess I'm going to stop the recording.
All right.
Okay.